Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamane. You are watching part of a 7-part series of a public webinar that I gave this past spring on 10 essential observations on guns in America. I hope that you find some value in this work. Everything that I do, I try to provide free with no paywall so that it's free to you. But honestly, this work is not free to me. So if you would like to help support my work, minimally, if you could like and share this work in your own social network so that more people have an opportunity to learn about what I'm doing and the education that I'm trying to give can spread beyond my own built-in social networks. If you would like to financially support the work I do and all of the infrastructure and time that it takes, in the show notes you'll see some options for doing that, notably making contributions through my Buy Me a Coffee platform, which is an alternative to Patreon that you may be more familiar with. So I do appreciate your support. I do hope you find some value in this work, and I do hope that you'll support me in one of these ways that makes sense to you. So here we are, Module 5 out of 7 on 10 essential observations on guns in America. So agenda, we'll do some housekeeping a little bit more than normal on the schedule because we're getting into a little bit of a wonky period. Then I'll sort of recap where we're at with respect to Wright's 10 observations. And this module and next module really get us into a couple of areas that are not exactly my strength. I certainly am not an expert in criminal gun ownership. I'm not an expert in gun violence. I'm not an expert in gun control. But one of the things about teaching any kind of survey course, and I tell my intro Soc students this all the time, is that I end up having to teach things that are not in my wheelhouse. So I will do my best this week and next to talk about criminal gun ownership, about gun violence in relation to criminal gun ownership, and about gun control, even though, again, not my strong suits. Here we're connecting to Wright's observations number 5 and 6. For module 6, we'll do 7 and 8. And then for the final module 7, we'll do observations 9 and 10. And if time permits, as it has in the past, we will go ahead and do Q&A. I'll be interested to see whether I've prepared an hour's worth of material today, since, again, not my strong suit. Okay, so let's turn to Wright's observations 5 and 6. But first, again, these are module 1. We covered the first 2 observations, held those to be largely true, although, the specific numbers vary a little bit. Modules 2 and 3, we talked about the evolution of gun culture toward gun culture 2.0, talked about the concealed carry revolution. And then in module 4, we talked about the second part of observation 4 about defensive gun use, how we understand defensive gun use, and also numbers, as well as this issue of the subjective safety that people feel when they have defensive firearms. Okay, so Wright's observation 5 is that, and here again, we're turning towards criminal gun ownership and use. The bad guys do not get their guns through customary retail channels. And observation 6, the bad guys inhabit a violent world. A gun often makes a life or death difference to them. Okay, so I want to actually treat these in the reverse order to kind of establish that the bad guys inhabit a violent world, that guns make a life or death difference to them, and therefore this actually, motivates them to get firearms outside of the normal retail channels. Okay, so with some observations about violence more generally to start, violence in society is what I would say is a constant and a variable. So here, drawing on scholar Larry Ray, says violence has been ubiquitous in human history, right? So violence is a constant, But like all other forms of human behavior, it has been socially and culturally organized and varies greatly in its nature and extent over time and between societies, to which I would simply add, and also within societies. Okay, so violence, is a constant, but what really concerns us here is that violence is a variable. So we can talk about the social distribution of firearms, death, and injury, right? The social distribution of violence enacted with firearms, right? So, and I know some people object to the term gun violence. They say we don't talk about knife violence or stick violence, et cetera. For me, it's a fine shorthand. I think that I'm not going to get into the semantic debate here. I'll just say, how is gun violence, homicide, and injury socially distributed in unequal patterns? And we can look at different demographic patterns. We can look at geographic patterns, and we can look at patterns in terms of behavior and in terms of networks of people who engage in certain behavior. So this falls, right in the wheelhouse of sociology, even if it doesn't fall in my wheelhouse as a sociologist of guns. Another caveat going into this is that really helps for us to think about the fact that homicidal violence has declined long term in American society, right? We are so data saturated these days. We're so focused on looking at gun violence from year to year. We tend to lose sight of, not gun violence, homicidal violence. We tend to lose sight of the fact that we live in quite peaceable times here. And, I think his work has been criticized in certain important ways, but certainly Steven Pinker, in his argument about the better angels of our nature, talks about all of the many different ways in which our everyday lives in the United States are much, much less violent than we've seen over the long course of human history. So this is really important to keep in mind, not to say, to trivialize violence, not to trivialize homicide or injury, but really, to have some broad perspective on what we're talking about here. So again, gun violence, even over the course of the 20th century or, in the last 120 years, we see both kind of long-term trends of fluctuation and also year-to-year trends that fluctuate up and down. So we've, depending on what's happening socially, again, we see fluctuations in homicide or murder from year to year because of those broader social phenomena that are happening. And again, in recent history, just looking at, from this bottom, 1963, 4.6 per 100,000, the historically low rate of gun violence, which then surged, of course, in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. So, 10.4 per 100,000 in 1980, 9.8 in 1991, but then again, bottoming out at an even lower level, a historically low level in 2014. And then in 2021, again, we saw a spike during COVID, and then starting to come back down now. So again, lots of fluctuations from year to year and also over time. But again, most recently, about 6.8 per 100,000 is our homicide rate. That includes both firearms homicide and non-firearms homicides, although the majority of homicides are by firearm in the United States. Okay, and again, this might remind you of this little thing that we have talked about in the past called the problem with averages, right? So if we say that the US homicide rate in 2021 was 6.8 per 100,000, this overall average hides a lot of underlying variation, right? There's a very different distributions within the population that lead to that aggregate rate. And for example, we can look at the homicide rate by race and age. This is data that I culled from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, their Center for Gun Violence Solutions. So, certainly no sympathy for guns in that organization. I think that the data speaks for itself. At every age group, except for this odd 65 to 74-year-old age group, we see that the rate of homicide among Blacks is multiples higher than the rate of homicide among whites. Again, so think about 6.8 or 7 per 100,000 on average. We're talking about an agglomeration or a combination of 2 to 3 per 100,000, and in some cases 60 per 100,000, 20 times or 16 times, depending on the age group you're looking at. Again, so the problem with averages, it hides this underlying variation. But again, going back to Ray's idea, right, that violence varies systematically between and within societies and over time. And this is one of the most important variations we need to understand: age and race. And so, again, when we talk about international comparisons, which a lot of people like to do, they typically will offer the US gun homicide rate or overall homicide rate in comparison to various other comparable countries, oftentimes in Europe. And, again, the comparisons don't look good, but they look less bad, depending on the particular group you're looking at, right? So the underlying unequal distribution, right, the murder inequality that we see in the United States creates a bit of a difficulty in making these direct international comparisons. And I'd also add that, America is exceptionally violent, even without the guns, right? If you take away all firearms homicides and look just at non-firearms homicides in the United States, the rate was 1.44 per 100,000 in 2019. That's higher than the overall homicide rate in 22 of 37 OECD nations. Okay, so even if you take out firearms homicides, the United States has a very high homicide rate for the type of country that the United States is, which is an advanced industrial democracy. Now, it's homicide is geographically distributed unequally, so we can look at the homicide rate in different states, and you can see based on the lighter to darker color where there's more or less homicide. And so you can see, in places like Idaho or Massachusetts, very low rates of homicide. If you look at a place like Louisiana, very high rate of homicide, and my current home state of North Carolina, fairly close to the average homicide rate for the country. Right? But we don't just live in particular states, we actually live in particular counties. And you can see here again,
David,
yes.
someone says they can't see the slides. Oh, Kirk can't see the slides.
Can you see the slides, Sandy?
I can see them.
Okay. Kirk, I don't know what's happening.
Okay. It's user error, Kirk. Just kidding.
I mean, is anybody else in the chat saying they can't see the slides? Sandy? Sandy? I lost Sandy. Is anybody in the chat unable to see the slides? I don't want to proceed on if it's a systematic problem. All right, let me try this. I'm going to stop the sharing. I don't know if Sandy is gone. I'm going to stop the sharing, and then I'm going to restart the sharing. And somebody please tell me what they're seeing. Sandy?
You can see them. Oh.
Okay. What are people in the chat saying?
Slides are back.
Slides are back. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Well, I'm not sure if people missed out at what point people missed out, but I was talking about the unequal distribution of homicide by state, but also we don't live in the United States. We live in particular states, but we don't just live in particular states. we live in particular counties. And you can see, even in the same state, you can have different homicide rates from county to county. And here we're, not just looking at a urban rural divide, because if you look at some of the counties that have the highest homicide rates in the country, Phillips County in Arkansas, Lowndes County, Alabama, Macon County, Alabama, Petersburg City in Virginia, are all fairly rural counties. St. Louis City, Missouri is actually the city of St. Louis, so that's very urban. So, when we're talking about county homicide rates, you can have a rural county and a very high rate of homicide. But of course, we don't just live within certain counties, we live in particular municipalities or cities. And here we do see in the aggregate, big cities tend to have higher overall, higher homicide rates than the country as a whole. So within cities, if we talk about homicide rate of about 7.5 in 2020, you can see some major cities in the United States have homicide rates that are many multiples of that, right? So you can live in a rural county and have a very high homicide rate. You can live in particular cities and have an extremely high homicide rate. But the point being that there is this murder inequality where you live affects what your homicide rate that you're exposed to is. And again, this idea that no one lives in the United States, we can break down various homicide rates in parts of the United States and compare them to the homicide rates in various other countries in the world, highlighting again where you live affects what sort of homicide rates you're exposed to. And that's true here in North Carolina, right? You can go to New Bern, which is a beautiful city, as well as Asheville. You have a lower than average homicide rate. You can go to someplace like High Point or Rocky Mount. You have a much higher homicide rate. Here in Winston-Salem, we're sort of in the middle, about 12.5 per 100,000 in 2019. So higher than the national average, but lower than some places in North Carolina, higher than other places in North Carolina. But again, we don't just live in particular cities. This is a map that shows assault victimization in the city of Winston-Salem. And you can see that assault concentrates in particular areas, right? So, this is the area that when I lived in Winston-Salem, I lived around there. This is, a very peaceful place. My likelihood of being an assault victimization where I lived was very low. And this is what we call sociologically or in public health, a health disparity, right? That we are exposed to different levels of violence depending on where we live. Again, doesn't make sense really to talk about the violence rate in the United States. We really need to talk about the violence rate in a very granular way. And it's not even just living in a particular neighborhood. I know it's very common for some people to write off entire neighborhoods. There's been some pretty offensive things said by people like Colonel Jeff Cooper about the violence that exists in certain inner city areas. But really, violence concentrates quite heavily even within neighborhoods. This is called the law of crime concentration. So we don't even look at states, counties, cities, or neighborhoods. We can actually look at street segments to see this, right? So a street segment is, one half or one face of a standard city block, right? That's between two intersections. And so if we look at violence or crime at the street segment level, we can see, for example, in the city of Chicago, 50% of all crimes in the city of Chicago take place on less than 10% of street segments. 50% of all crime in the city of New York takes place on less than 5% of street segments. 50% of all crime in Philadelphia takes place on less than 10% of street segments. So we're really talking about an extreme concentration of crime. So again, geographically, looking at murder inequality or exposure to violence inequality as a health disparity at this granular level geographically, but we shouldn't also forget that there are certain behavioral risk factors that lead people to be more susceptible to violent victimization, right? So again, in gun culture terms, this is the rules of stupid, John Farnham's rules of stupid: don't go stupid places and do stupid things with stupid people at stupid times, right? Those are behavioral risk factors for victimization. So David Kennedy, whose book Don't Shoot, um, I read very early on in my study of guns, and it really, I think, had a very fundamental effect on the way I understand and approach the issue of gun violence and how to ameliorate gun violence. But he's looking at Boston members of gangs and neighborhood turf groups in the mid to late 1990s in Boston, when things were just terrible there. And they found that the homicide rate among some of these groups was as high as 3,000 per 100,000, right? So being in particular areas and doing particular things dramatically increases your likelihood of homicide victimization, right? Being involved in crime, especially robbery and drug dealing and use, or if you beef with other members of turf groups over respect, these things greatly increase your likelihood of victimization. And so this gives rise to the idea that gun violence is what Andrew Papachristos called tragic but not random, right? Gun violence is unfortunate. It's terrible. It affects people in terrible ways. It has effects on people around the people who are victims of gun violence, but it's not randomly distributed through the population. Okay, again, that's 6.8 per 100,000 homicide rate in the United States for 2021 is not randomly distributed through the population. So firearms, homicide, and injury are socially contagious, right, based on people's behaviors. And this, if you've seen Gary Slutkin out of Chicago, his TED Talk, about treating violence like a contagious disease and trying to stop the spread of violence using some of those same methods that you would use to interrupt contagious disease. We'll actually talk more about that in Module 6 when we talk about gun violence prevention. So Andrew Papachristos, again, one of my favorite scholars who does study the negative outcomes with firearms, studies gun homicide and injury, and finds it clusters in small geographic areas within major US cities, right? So here, again, we're talking about those street segments, especially in socially and economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, right? So I didn't mention it, but I could have mentioned when I was showing that map of the concentration of assault victimization in Winston-Salem. If you overlaid that map with a map of the concentration of poverty in the city of Winston-Salem, those two maps overlap almost completely, right? So again, going back to Ray's ideas about violence, violence is a constant and also a variable. And one of the things that violence varies with is social disadvantage. Okay. So what does this mean? It means that most people in these disadvantaged neighborhoods are not subject to violent victimization directly, although there are many indirect effects of victimization. So, I think of, the people living in these crime-ridden, economically disadvantaged neighborhoods are actually victims of crime as opposed to perpetrators of crime, right? And a lot of times when people are talking about homicide or gun injury or criminal behavior or gang behavior, it's made to seem as if that's a problem that takes place in that neighborhood and that everybody contributes to that problem. This is the furthest thing from the truth. It's often even a small handful of people in a particular neighborhood can ruin the neighborhood for everybody living there. So why do some people with certain risk factors, right? So you can take people who have all of the risk factors that are associated with higher rates of homicide and injury. So young Black men in disadvantaged neighborhoods, right? But some of those people will become victims of gunshot death and injury, and others won't. And in fact, most others will not. So what is the difference between those who have all of those risk factors and those who don't. And Papachristos' answer is really it has to do with social networks, right? The people who are likely to be shot and killed or injured are part of social networks through which this violence passes, right? Again, the idea that it is like a contagious disease. So Papachristos talks about network exposure and the risk of gunshot injury. So a network is a high risk social network of people engaged in social behavior. In the case of this one study, he's looking at street level violence in a high crime Cape Verdean community in Boston. And the way that they construct the network for analytical purposes is by identifying two or more people who are observed together, in this case by the police, and then their co-presence is recorded in these field intelligence observation reports or cards, right? So they began with these known gang members and then used the cards to see who associated with these gang members, right? So you become a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of one of these gang members, okay? And like needle sharing or unprotected sex and the spread of HIV, these network connections expose individuals to situations, behaviors, and people that elevate the probability of homicide victimization. Again, this victimization is tragic, but it's not random. It runs through these social networks of people who are engaged in high risk behavior, right? Again, it's, when I was growing up in the 1980s, we were always told if you have unprotected sex, you're having sex with every person that that person has had unprotected sex with. This is that same idea. So the nice thing about this social network analysis is that you can create these really interesting and telling graphics. So this is the social network that was created in this Cape Verdean community by, again, observing people who are engaging in high risk behavior with other people or the people that they associate with them. This is, again, that Cape Verdean community. So in that graphic, there are 57 distinct subnetworks, right? 763 dots divided into 57 subnetworks. But the key is that 76% of everybody in that graphic is actually part of a single network, right? You are connected to, if you're in that network, 578 other people, right? And that becomes consequential because 85% of the gunshot victims that were studied in this Cape Verdean community were within that social network, right? So 85% of everybody who was shot during the study period were connected to each other in that single large network. And this term geodesic distance from any individual and a gunshot victim is 4.69. So the way you can think about that is that if you're in that one large network, you are 5 handshakes away from someone who has been shot. Right? And each handshake away from someone who has been shot drops your odds of gunshot victimization by 25%. Right? So the further you are away from the core of that social network, the less likely you are to be shot. But the closer you get to a homicide or a gunshot victim, the higher your odds of being shot yourself. Right? Again, it's a friend of a friend of a friend. Your friend's friend's friend being shot increases your likelihood of being shot. And you can do this also for homicide. And this is what's been on my mind, apparently, when I was talking about homicide rather than injury. Again, this is the same thing that Papachristos did, except for a particular neighborhood in the city of Chicago. So in this particular diagram, 41% of all of the homicides were in a network of just 4% of the population, right? So almost half of all the homicides were clustered among a network that was very small. So again, if you look at the overall homicide rate in Chicago, it's 14.7. If you look at the neighborhood homicide rate that they were looking at, because this was a high risk neighborhood, 55 per 100,000. But if you were in that network, right, 554 per 100,000 is the homicide rate. So an incredibly high rate of victimization for people who are engaged in high risk behavior in these social networks. And again, I want to repeat, most of the residents, even in this neighborhood, were not perpetrators of violence. They are victims of violence, and typically indirect victims of violence, because if you live in a violent neighborhood, it affects you in many, many ways. Okay, so again, this idea that bad guys inhabit a violent world, right? If you're part of a neighborhood turf group in Boston, or if you're part of a high risk gang related network in Cape Verdean community in Boston, or in a dangerous neighborhood in Chicago, right? You are inhabiting a violent world. We see this in a study of detainees at LA County Jail. If you ask these detainees, have you ever been personally shot at? 44% of these detainees have been personally shot at, and 28% admit to having personally shot at somebody. And over half say that they have a friend who or relative who has shot at someone or has been shot at. Okay, so again, these people who end up in county jail, the bad guys in rights terms, are inhabiting a quite violent world. I don't know that 44% of the people that I associate with have been shot at some point in their life. I suspect it's much lower than that. Okay, we also see this violent world that these quote unquote bad guys exist in. If we look at what happens to people during prisoner reentry, and here, we observe what's called the victim offender overlap. So victims of crime and criminal offenders are often not two separate groups of people, right? But they're really the same group of people, right? They both victimize people, and they're also victims themselves, right? So we see this as people who are released from prison for doing violent crimes, and they end up being violent victims themselves. Okay? The majority of these individuals returning to risky, impoverished urban neighborhoods, poor family environments with strained family relationships, and this sort of creates this revolving door of recidivism, right? You're in jail, you're out of jail, you're back to jail, and oftentimes people are not reporting this victimization to police because there's not a level of trust there. Okay? Victimization during reentry affects your mental health, which again makes you more likely to engage in recidivistic activity, right? But in the 15 months following reentry, 45% of these people in this particular study experienced some sort of physical violence, right? And as you can see, as their violent victimization went up, their anxiety and depression also went up. Okay, so the bad guys inhabit a violent world. A gun often makes a life or death difference to them, right? If you inhabit a violent world, right, you may want a gun for self-defense. Many of us uh, live in very non-violent worlds, and yet we still oftentimes choose to have a gun for our personal protection. And here, again, it's particularly among people who are involved in the criminal justice system, right? They engage in what people call extra legal self-help by owning firearms for self-defense, right? It's extra legal in this case because many, if not most of these people are prohibited persons, right? So they can't legally carry firearms, but they want to engage in self-help, so they're going to carry firearms for self-defense because they inhabit a violent world. So here, this idea of legal citicism is raised, right? So if you live in a neighborhood that is characterized by high violence, that you exhibit a unique, culturally defined, not you, many exhibit a unique, culturally defined orientation known as legal cynicism, a frame in which the criminal justice system and its agents are viewed as illegitimate, unresponsive, and ill-equipped to ensure the safety of community residents, right? And this is not a new idea, right? It goes back, in my day to Public Enemy, which, put out a very famous song called 911 is a Joke. This reflects that kind of legal cynicism. And that's also actually not just confined to, urban youth, Jenny Carlson has actually written about this idea of I don't not dial 911 as part and parcel of American gun politics, right? And you see a version of this espoused by, typically sort of libertarian white folks, but it also reflects this legal cynicism among urban Black folks. So this erosion of legitimacy is something that we see among people, again, in this study of detainees at LA County Jail, right? The sense of failed protection by the state produced by these particularly bad encounters that people have with the police ultimately help create a context whereby illegal gun carry was positioned as a more viable, even necessary self-help strategy to ensure one's safety, right? Again, rights, 30-year-old idea that the bad guys inhabit a violent world and a gun can seem to be the difference between life and death for them is perfectly reflected in this contemporary study of detainees at the LA County Jail. And here's just a sample quote. I'm not trying to blame anybody, but one time somebody broke into my house. I called the police and said my computer was stolen. Police never came. And on top of that, if a fatality happened based on gang-related activity, they don't even investigate. Gang members feel like we got to take matters into our own hands. They ain't going to do nothing to help gang banging people, right? So again, you inhabit a violent world. You don't look to the state or the police to protect you. You don't trust the state or the police to protect you. And so you get a gun for self-help. Again, not very different than some of the things that we hear within the gun culture by people who come from very different social backgrounds who are like, you're on your own, you're your own first responder. I carry a gun because I can't carry a cop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this was an interesting study of Crown Heights in Brooklyn, young gun carriers, and that, again, guns in this violent world, predominantly young Black men. Gun carriers talked about experiencing, witnessing, and being threatened with violence at shocking rates. They inhabit a violent world and afraid and distrustful of police and few other means to ensure their safety. Many of them turn to gun carrying for self-preservation. For most youth, fear for their own lives and the lives of their families outweighed concerns about going to jail. And again, if you're familiar with American gun culture, you know that you'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. And I remember one of the very first academic conferences I ever went to at the American Society of Criminology. One of the first panels I ever went to, and where they were talking about guns and gun carrying, they quoted someone who was at the LA County Jail who said to the researcher, I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6, right? So I study sort of legal defensive gun culture, but many of the same principles animating legal defensive gun culture also animate criminal gun culture. So again, the bad guys inhabit a violent world. A gun often makes a life or death difference to them. The same today as it was in Wright's time. Okay. So if guns make a life or death difference to you, you may do whatever you can to get your hands on a gun. And so this takes us back to observation number 5, that the bad guys do not get their guns through customary retail channels. And so we want to say, is this the same in 2024 as it was in 1995? Again, I'm not expert in this area, but I, just want to highlight a couple of studies that do speak directly to this issue. This one fairly well-known and commonly cited study of the sources of guns to dangerous people, what we learn by asking them, right? So they looked at gun-involved, criminally active men in the greater Chicago area, 99 inmates at the Cook County Jail, right? So they had been arrested an average of a range of 2 to 54 times. On average, they had been arrested 13 times and convicted 2.5 times, right? So when we talk about criminally active men, that this is the level of activity we're talking about. These are dangerous people. who we may not want to have guns, but who are highly motivated to have guns because of their lives and their activities. So, where do they get their guns? Do they get them through customary retail channels? In this study, 2 of the 70 primary guns were gotten at gun stores, so about 3%. None of the 65 secondary guns were purchased at gun stores. And so 2 out of 135, or 1.5% of all of the guns in this study, were purchased through customary retail channels, right? So frequently, guns were gotten from mutual acquaintances, from the black market, or from the streets, or through more commonly through prior relationships people had, family, gang members, or other connections. So again, Wright's onto something when he says that the bad guys don't get their guns through customary retail channels. Saw this again in a study of Baltimore's underground gun market. These are many scholars from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and also UC Davis. So again, fairly mainstream public health researchers looking at 58 adult men who are on probation or parole in Baltimore who attempted to get a gun in the 6 months before the survey. Right. So they're studying more than these 58 men, but in terms of in terms of those who were trying to get a gun in the previous 6 months, there were 58. And of those, a minority, 41%, were successful and 53% were unsuccessful. Right. So most of the people who had tried to get a gun in the 6 months before the survey was taken weren't able to get a gun. So I think that's an interesting finding in itself when we think about oftentimes that underground markets are flush with guns. I think researchers actually find that quite frequently underground markets have actually fairly low supply of guns, and the prices actually become quite high because of that. So they asked these folks, have you ever asked someone to buy a gun from a gun shop or pawn shop on your behalf? So this isn't in the previous 6 months, this is ever. Right? So have you asked someone to basically make an illegal straw purchase for you? 17% had, 80% said they hadn't, 3% refused to answer. So maybe those ones probably did. So say 20% of people had ever asked someone to make a straw purchase for them. Were they successful? About half of them. So 5 out of the 56 people, about 9%, had successfully made a straw purchase before. But in terms of accessing firearms in the previous 6 months, right, only 1 of the 58 people said someone else bought the gun for them. So straw purchasing, not a very common way for these criminally involved people in the city of Baltimore to get guns. How do they get guns? They steal them, they rent them, they borrow them, they hold them for someone else, they share them, they trade them, they bought them themselves on the black market, not from customary retail channels. So again, I think a lot of consistency in Wright's observation there. Now, we hear a lot about gun theft is sort of a big way that guns get into the underground market. So this is an interesting study that was done of gun owners and how many of them and who had guns stolen from them. So 2.5% of the respondents in this survey reported that 1 or more guns had been stolen from them. Average number of guns stolen, 1.5. Now, interestingly, risk factors, like what makes you more likely as a gun owner to have a gun stolen from you? Owning a lot of guns. Okay, I don't know why that leads you to be more likely to have guns stolen. Maybe the more guns you own, the more casual you are with them, or the more likely are people to target you because they know you have a whole cache of guns in your house. If you own guns for protection or carry the gun in the past month, you're actually more likely to have had a gun stolen. I have some thoughts on that maybe I can share in the Q&A. If you store guns unsafely, not surprisingly, and if you live in the South, you're more likely. The South is, a minority of households and gun owners, but a majority of all the gun theft. So gun theft is a big problem in the South. So they estimate, about 250,000 gun thefts incidents a year with 380,000 guns stolen. I've heard, anywhere from 300 to 500,000 guns stolen annually. And again, not surprisingly, many, if not most of those guns end up going into the black market here in the United States, are probably also crossing the borders into Canada and Mexico and elsewhere. A couple of other observations: women are 1.4 times more likely to have a gun stolen. Non-whites 3 times more likely to have a gun stolen. And if you store your gun in a car, 2.6 times more likely to have a gun stolen, which, again, brings to mind the increasingly common saying that your car is not a holster. If you decide that storing your gun in your car is a good idea, or more likely, you own a gun for protection and you carry it around, and then you end up taking it off because you can't go into the bank or the post office or some store with your gun, or your job. So you take it off, you put it in your car, you get home, you forgot you left it there, and then someone steals it. But again, gun acquisition, in terms of this study back in Cook County criminally active people, what percentage of all those guns were stolen? 1.5%, right? That the actual dangerous person stole the gun. But of course, you can also buy, trade, borrow, gift, or share a stolen gun. But in terms of, people directly stealing guns, not that huge. And this is maybe only tangentially related, but I know there's been a lot of talk recently about ghost guns, privately manufactured guns, non-serialized, privately manufactured guns. So, this is a study of almost 5,000 guns recovered in Oakland over a 5-year, 4-year period. Is that 4 or 5 years? 2017. That's 5 years. Are privately manufactured firearms and fast time to crime guns more likely to be used in violent crime? Why the concern for this study? The concern was the skyrocketing rate of gun homicides in the city of Oakland, especially in the COVID year and the year following the COVID year. So, big concern about what was driving that. And these authors answer the question: yes, during the pandemic, the odds increased that recovered firearms were privately manufactured or were recently purchased. And this is what the chart looks like, right? So by 2021, about a quarter of the guns recovered at crime scenes were privately manufactured or had been purchased within the last year. And then also, these privately manufactured firearms that were recovered were more likely to be recovered at scenes of, in cases of violent crime. So again, the question of ghost guns, this is what sort of animates concern about ghost guns, is that we're seeing them appear more and more, particularly in very violent areas, right? And again, to this question, right? Do the bad guys get their guns through customary retail channels? No, they don't, right? They typically get them from friends or associates. They get them on the black market. Perhaps increasingly, the guns that they get on the black market are privately manufactured firearms. But the bad guys do inhabit a violent world, and a gun does make a life or death difference to them. And so, as we'll talk about next week with Wright's observations, these animating underlying dynamics have implications for how we address the problem of gun violence and different sort of gun control or gun violence prevention approaches. That's for Module 6, but I'm close. Didn't quite run an hour this time. It's getting close to 7 o'clock. But let me open things up for Q&A. And I need to make that go away. So let me see what's happening in the Q&A. Looks like I have a few questions. Chad King asked if violence is ubiquitous. Is violence normal? Yeah, I mean, I think we have to conclude that violence is normal human behavior, and that, sorry, something is sticking to my feet under my desk. Um, violence is normal, and some violence at least is pro-social, right? That we need to use violence in order to keep people within our communities under control, to keep people from taking advantage of us, to ward off marauding tribes that are trying to decimate us. And so, yeah, I think that there is a normality to violence, both sort of the pro-social violence and also the inclination to criminal violence. Doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's normal. Homicide rate is sometimes a conflation of murder rate and suicide rate. For example, California has a low homicide rate, but a high murder rate. So I think that gun violence oftentimes conflates murder and suicide. I don't know that homicide rate conflates murder and suicide. Um, California has a low homicide rate, but a high murder rate. I don't quite understand that and that idea of the conflation. I mean, you know, we we don't consider justifiable homicide to be murder. All murders are homicides, not all homicides are murders, but the number of justifiable homicides in any given year is quite small relative to the number of criminal homicides. Sean Sorrentino, hey buddy, if you can overlay the map of violence with the map of poverty, does that show that poverty causes violence, that violence causes poverty, or that anyone with enough money would move out of violent neighborhoods? Um, yeah, I think, and this is something that will come up next week when we talk about gun violence prevention. I think that poverty and violence exist in a reciprocal relationship to one another, right? So, that people who are impoverished often turn to violence for lack of other better alternatives. But then, if there is a violent neighborhood, then people with means do frequently move out, leaving that neighborhood even more impoverished, which leads to ever more violence. So, I think, the things exist in a kind of um, not reciprocal or symbiotic relationship, but in a kind of iterative relationship to one another. So, we oftentimes hear, no justice, no peace. But in fact, that may be the case that, no peace, no justice, right? So you might have to pursue having some sort of peace or sort of tamping down violence in a neighborhood before you can fully address poverty. Although I think we also know that if you can address poverty, right, that you can also address violence. And one of the reasons why, we say, um, the gun violence in the United States, nobody lives in the United States, that some parts of the United States are gun rich and like European countries in terms of gun violence rates, and some places are gun rich and very much like the third world socially and in terms of violence rates. So it was a good question, good observation. Anonymous attendee. Oh, I didn't know we could have anonymous attendees. Maybe I should read the question before, because sometimes anonymous attendees are not fully on the level. But let me see. I trust people here. So generally speaking, profiling is just practical application of pure statistical data to protect all citizens. Putting law enforcement where the crime is like fishing in a stock pond versus your backyard pool. Yeah, I mean, this is what we call problem-oriented policing or hotspot policing. But the idea is that and this is Papachristos' idea with the networks. He's like, it doesn't make sense to police all young Black men in impoverished neighborhoods in a city, right? Because most of those people are not involved in criminal activity. What you want to do is observe the behavioral patterns and the network relationships that people have. So it's like super targeted policing, right? Super problem-oriented policing. The problem with profiling is that, most people, even in these very crime-ridden, very concentrated crime areas, are not perpetrators of violence. They're victims of violence. So if you're profiling them, you're basically profiling victims. So, the argument here is for extremely concentrated policing. And again, we'll talk next week in Module 6 about gun violence prevention. And there are some programs called focused deterrence, which really try to address this issue without over-policing. Jim Schrader, there was a chart with urban homicide rates that dropped dramatically starting in 92-93 timeframe and continued for a number of years. Has it been possible to track back the change that resulted in the dramatic drop in homicides? This is one of the, again, I'm not expert in this area, but people who do work in this area, they, there's not a single thing that leads to violence declines. I'm blanking on the name of the book. Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, this sociologist who wrote an entire book about the crime decline in New York City, and it's a combination of lots of different things. It's a combination of, community involvement, opportunity economically and socially. Also, policing plays a role. And so, one of the things when we're trying to say what causes violence to decline, we oftentimes want to identify a single thing that does it, but it's never, a single thing. And so that makes it difficult, right? Because you have to have a comprehensive and oftentimes quite costly plan in order to drive violence down. Is there a historical reason, this is Jim Sponauer, is there a historical research trend for any of these stats around acquisition of guns, et cetera, going back multiple decades? Are trends moving along as they always have, or are these trends newer? Instinctively, it seems it's the way it's always been. Not sure exactly, in terms of the question about acquisition of guns, but, we can look at a couple of things, right? The number of guns in the country has increased over time. The rate of gun ownership is probably roughly constant over time, so it's not increasing. But the rate of homicide and gun injury fluctuates up and down. Right? So there's no simple correlation between gun acquisition and negative outcomes with firearms. Though, obviously, when we talk about gun violence, a gun being present is a precondition of that. This is one of the reasons why people critique the idea of gun violence. But, again, the way I look at it is, and this is why I kind of begin with that, the long-term sort of secular trend in homicidal violence in the United States is downward. Right? This kind of increases our expectations that we can drive it ever further downward. But there is certain peculiar things about the United States that sort of limits how low we can drive that down. And, I think we would have to say that the presence of firearms is one of those things. Doesn't mean that you should sort of attempt firearms bans as the solution to that, although many people, they look at the experience of Europe or Japan or Australia and say, well, obviously, we should just start banning firearms and we can have homicide rates as low as those countries. But again, our non-firearms homicide rate is higher than England's total homicide rate, right? So there's something different about the United States than England, right? Size, diversity, levels of inequality, history of racial inequality, these sorts of things all contribute to that American exceptionalism. Also means undoing those issues becomes extremely complicated, as we'll see next week. Okay, anonymous again. Have I done any research or study on claims regarding guns being smuggled from low regulation states into high regulation states as a major source of crime guns? and do arguments that a state's gun laws are only as strong as their neighbors hold in water. I mean, yeah, to me, and I wish I remembered who said that, the fact is that we live in a federal system, so we do have a federal government. We're all part of a single country, but we also live in states. But these states, if you ever look at a sort of geographic map of the United States, you don't see state boundaries there, right? We can fairly easily flow from border to border, and it's kind of like saying you cannot pee in the shallow end of the pool, right? You can't pee in the deep end of the pool, right? But you can pee in the middle of the pool, right? The fact is, if someone's peeing in the middle of the pool and you're in the shallow or deep end where people aren't allowed to pee, you may get pee on you, right? So, it doesn't matter if the city of Chicago bans handguns. If you can get handguns outside of the city of Chicago, then the Chicago handgun ban is sort of meaningless. Now, there have been studies of uh, where crime guns come from. I didn't prep that material for this class, but certainly, depending on where you're looking, like when they were recovering guns in Boston in during that period in the 1990s when there was a really high rate of gun violence, a lot of those guns were coming up, the iron pipeline up I-95 from places like North Carolina. On the other hand, when they look at, I've seen a study in the city of Los Angeles, and most of the people who have crime guns in the city of Los Angeles didn't get them from out of state, right? It was easy enough for people to get guns in the state that they didn't need to traffic guns in from out of state. Or, for example, in the city of Oakland, right? If you're just having privately manufactured guns become a bigger and bigger source of crime guns, then you don't need to have guns smuggled in, right? But the fact is, I don't know the complete data, right? But it just to me intuitively makes sense that if you are in a state and you're trying to ban certain firearms, but people can get those firearms in adjoining states, and then they will do that. So I don't have a better answer to that. I mean, there is data out there, but again, this is, as I said at the start, not my strongest area, since I don't consider myself a scholar of gun crime or gun violence. Does detailing the disproportionate violence in certain African American communities end up being negatively treated, like Charles Murray's studies on IQ? Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen I mean, it's tricky, right? Anytime we talk about race, it gets tricky. I deal with this in my intro Soc class all the time, and I tell the students, we're going to make progress in talking about race. We have to sort of assume the best intentions of the people that we're talking about, and not immediately try to cancel people. Now, I tend to think Charles Murray's studies of IQ are garbage. But I'm not going to say he shouldn't be able to publish them. I say go ahead and publish them, and people who disagree with them will refute them. But I think the problem when we see something like that one of those early slides, like if you're, a young Black man, right, you're 60 times more likely to be a homicide victim than a young white man, right? And then people go from that to assume there is something wrong with young Black men, right? When in fact, the majority of young Black men are neither killing people, right, nor being killed, right? They're not shooting people, nor are they being shot, right? So it's not an African American problem. It's a problem among certain people within that community. And so, that's the way I treat that. I say we need to really drill down and understand what is it about certain people within those communities that becomes highly problematic. And this is again why I like Papachristos' studies, is he gives us a way to identify, even within this high risk group, who are the particular people who are engaged in this activity, right? And then I think it also allows us to say the vast majority of African Americans living in high crime neighborhoods are victims, right? They're not people who deserve our scorn. They're not people who we should talk about having a dysfunctional culture, right? They are literally victims trying to survive in a terrible situation that if they could escape, they would probably try to escape, right? And, I'm not going to go into it now, but this is where we need to understand, why is the United States so racially segregated, right? Because we have a history of legal and economic segregation of people by race. So we actively created these disadvantaged communities that then become victims of a certain small proportion of people in those communities. That's the way I deal with that. I guess my probably this week and next week, more than any other weeks, my being a liberal professor is going to come out. Are there studies correlating two-parent households to violence levels in neighborhoods? Um, I'm sure there are. I remember reading for review a book about inner city violence, and the lack of male role models was a huge predictor of which kids in those neighborhoods would become criminally involved. So there, certainly there's the question of why is it that two-parent households are better. One is that you have potentially two sources of income, so you have more resources at your disposal. The other has to do with sort of stability and role modeling. But certainly, one of the things that correlates most highly with poverty is being a single parent female headed household. And so if poverty overlaps with homicide victimization, right, it stands to reason that there's some connection going on between those two things. Again, I don't have, I'm certain that there are studies of this. The study that I'm referring to was a more qualitative study, but I wouldn't be very surprised if the statistical data didn't back up that observation. Scott Estes, one of the explanations in the homicide rate decline is improved medical care. Instead of dying, they don't get counted. Yeah. So this is, one of the things that people have said is that trauma medicine has become better and better, particularly in our, very, 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 very long global war on terror. And so, again, if you're shot, you don't die. And so one of the reasons why the homicide rate may be declining is not because is because of this sort of intervention in the process. Does also mean that more people may be surviving their gunshot injuries, and this is sort of one of the lost stories of the harm that's done by gunshot injuries. Is like, if 2/3 of people who are shot criminally survive, they have all sorts of physical, emotional, sort of intellectual, social problems that they have to deal with in relation to that. And oftentimes, given the fact that if you're impoverished, you're more likely to be a gunshot victim. You don't have access to the kind of resources that are going to help you overcome that trauma of being a gunshot victim. Tovis, does the comparison in homicide rate between the US and other high income nations that gun violence prevention groups often use intentionally exclude African and South American nations? Um, well, I don't know that they intentionally exclude them. They typically, like, for example, in the data that I gave, I said Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD nations. Now, I can't name all 37 OECD nations off the top of my head, but I think that's a relevant comparison aspirationally for the United States, because I think we think of ourselves as being a high human development index country. But again, the problem is that in certain ways, there are certain parts of the United States that we might better be compared to a developing country in Africa or South America than to a developed country, because these places are extremely impoverished. I think we have to just be sensitive in the comparisons that we're using. To me, the problem is that so many people who are involved in the gun debates, right? They just want to use the data to win an argument, right? So depending on how you want to win the argument, you invoke a certain comparison group versus another comparison group. For me, I don't feel like I'm trying to win an argument here. I'm trying to enlighten how the world works. And so, in many cases, I think the appropriate comparison are other high income, high human development index countries. And in other ways, it makes sense to think about us in relationship to all of the countries of the world. Okay. So, I think that's, when you say intentionally include, makes it sound sort of manipulative, but I guess, it depends on your intention. If you want to know what the U.S. looks like in terms of our peer or aspirational peer countries, then look at our peer or aspirational peer countries. I don't think Zambia, or Namibia or Brazil is an aspirational peer for the United States. Regarding the 1992 decline in violence, there's also a significant time when the economy was bustling. People who supported an assault weapon ban pointed to this decline in gun violence as a result, probably incorrectly, of the Clinton era assault weapons ban. Yeah, for sure, Edward, the rate of gun violence was declining already. It really peaked out, in the early 80s and then again in the early 90s, in relation to the crack epidemic in particular when you're talking about homicidal violence. So it's hard to pinpoint the effect of any particular law because there's so many other things happening in society around that, and we're definitely entering into a period of fairly sustained economic development, which definitely helps. John Hendrickson, have I read any studies that discuss what percentage of firearms that are later used by criminal demographics are in fact stolen? Only a very tiny minority of firearms within a given year are stolen in comparison to the total number in circulation. Still, hundreds of thousands are stolen. It seems like stolen firearms can provide a large arsenal for criminals across the U.S. and globe to access. Yeah. Again, I'm not expert enough in this area to be able to pull studies off of the top of my head in terms of the firearms that are found, or sort of maybe firearms that are recovered at crime scenes, whether they were stolen or not. But it is often the case that firearms recovered at crime scenes were not being used by the original purchaser, right? So you do an ATF trace on a firearm, it's likely to have changed hands many times, either through theft or off the book sale. But I certainly think if you have 380,000 firearms stolen, or 500,000, or even say 250,000 firearms stolen a year in a conservative estimate, right? People are not stealing firearms to put in their personal, like, law-abiding gun owners are not out stealing guns. I guess that's maybe the simplest way to put it. But again, I apologize. I can't. In some areas, I'm better able to pull answers or studies off of the top of my head. It's a lot of work for me just to get up to this basic rudimentary level of understanding of criminal gun ownership, criminal gun use, underground gun markets. Hopefully, I provided some useful information today, despite the fact that it's not my main area of scholarship. And again, I think a lot of things that I hinted at today, I'll look at what can be done about it. If this is the reality of how criminals behave, how gun violence works, in terms of criminal gun violence, what can be done about that. And the next two observations of Wright's really deal with the question of gun control as he would have characterized it back in 1995. And so I'll talk about gun control evolution to gun violence prevention, and what might work and what won't necessarily work. Having no other questions in the queue, I definitely appreciate the 60 of you who have stayed through to the bitter end here. Appreciate your attention. For those of you who weren't able to make it today and are watching this video after the fact, thank you so much for taking time to watch all the way to the end.